Thank you, Sarah, for this really interesting introduction and breakdown over the past few days. And I hope that you can hear me well, by the way.
Yeah.
My computer's, yep, having a little bit of a issue, but I will begin my presentation now because I only have 10 minutes and this topic is quite comprehensive. And to admit that we're just beginning on the process, so a lot of questions still remain. But I want to highlight, maybe moving on to the next slide, about what we mean towards the sustainable resource management law. So on the left-hand side, we can see that the Global Resources Outlook 2024 predicts that global consumption of raw materials will increase in a business as usual scenario by 60% by 2060. This is really dangerous for the biosphere, for what we called well, not only for humans, but also our ecosystems and how they're able to contain this level of exponential material consumption. On the right-hand side, you can see already that by 2020, effectively, anthropogenic mass, so human-made mass, was able to supersede already biomass in terms of tonnage. So we are increasingly exceeding the biocapacity of the Earth based on the materials that we consume. And this rise in material consumption is rising much higher actually than even population increase. Though population does have somewhat of an impact, the consumption is actually coming from much more affluent countries. Can you go to the next slide? And on the left-hand side, you can see what we mean. So basically, in the EU, I'm using the EU because we're working on this topic at the European Environmental Bureau, and we're centered here in Brussels. And we see that the EU has an over demanding type of resource consumption and production. On the left-hand side, despite all of the initiatives that we have made in terms of circular economy, resource efficiency, and all of these policies that are coming out, our material footprint, which really gives us a calculation, even though it's weight-based, still is a good proxy for our consumption, how our consumption is impacting the planet. And it's broken down into 4 categories: biomass, metal ores, non-metallic minerals, and fossil fuels. As you can see from the material footprint on the left-hand side, the only times that our material footprint effectively increased in Europe in a considerable amount was actually 2 ways. One of them was in the 2008 financial crisis, which was the biggest drop, and then over again in 2020, even though in 2020, of course, was caused by the COVID pandemic, but since then it has actually recuperated. So what this tells us is that despite the technological efficiencies that we have achieved over the past decades, despite much more analysis on resource management, we unfortunately do not have the data that our economies are becoming much more sustainable, right? From a materials perspective. On the right-hand side, you can see what I mean by this. Since 2000, the material consumption of Europe, EECA, or North America, in the case of North America and Europe, has decreased a little bit, so not substantially. And as I mentioned, the reasons why that decrease happened. In other countries, in other regions, sorry, such as in Africa, they have only increased their material footprint by 1 ton since 2000. So there's, of course, a need to discuss what does resource management actually look like around the world when some countries are under consuming and other countries are over consuming. Next slide, please. We can see as well here that when it comes to consumption of the EU, despite the fact that we have a very high and double the sustainable limits of planetary boundaries, we actually see that in terms of the donut, which many participants are probably familiar with, this is some recent research, where actually many countries in the EU are not meeting the social distance index, so meaning that we're underachieving in a lot of these social indicators, and we're overachieving in terms of the ecological ceiling. So even though we're talking about a lot of consumption of raw materials on the material footprint category, we're actually not even meeting societal needs. So this consumption, in a sense, consumption and production, is not necessarily leading to higher well-being metrics. So where do we do now? We have a lot of legislation on climate law. We have a lot of emphasis on sustainability, of course, but we're trying to work towards a more comprehensive outlook. Next slide, please. So this is what we mean by sustainable resource management within the EU. And this is the EEB working with a few other organizations, as you can see on the screen. And we have come out with a white paper that came out actually last month. In this white paper, next slide, please. We basically make the case that we need to escape the carbon tunnel vision. Yes, of course, climate action is absolutely necessary, and we are really meeting some concerning future developments. But this cannot be done solely on a carbon emissions lens. We need to also tie in raw materials. How do we build cities? How do we consume and produce? And how this impacts also countries in the global south, right? We can move on to the next slide. So then we're arguing for a directive at the moment, whether it is a legislation or directive. This is something that we're working with. But the main thing that we want to focus is on an actual binding reduction of the EU's material footprint from 14.8 tons per capita, which is a 2023 measures from Eurostat, to actually 5 tons per capita by 2050, with midterm targets and differentiated national targets as well, similar to what we have for carbon emissions. Of course, the targets of France, the targets of Germany will differ greatly in terms of the targets of Malta, targets of Lithuania, targets of Greece, for example. And this has to happen through a democratic argumentation. Next slide, please. So a lot of this work has actually been developed already by OVAM, who did a study, particularly on this topic. One of the things that they are arguing for as well is having an EU resources law, and then breaking it down into fair distribution of material resources, sector-specific roadmap. So like I mentioned before, creating sub-targets. So you have your national target, and you might have your regional target, you might have an urban target, and then also connecting these targets to industry or sector-specific targets that are able to be the ones that are the most resource intensive, and how do we reduce them, right? And this would have to align very well, of course, with the climate targets and circularity targets that are already ongoing. And then lastly, the main really important thing is that within our resource management law, we want to make sure that we see in stronger emphasis actually on a just transition. So how do workers can benefit from an economy that uses less materials? It's not just about reducing everything and hoping to meet planetary boundary measures. Yeah, it's about actually deciding democratically through deliberations, through climate assemblies, through policies about how do we actually achieve this reduction beyond, of course, just hoping that technology will fix it. So this will require a democratic process, and this will require, of course, strong citizens' involvement about how do we really get urban areas, countries as well, to come up with policies that are actually able to bring down that material footprint. Next slide, please. And I'm almost done. Aware of the time, I only have 2 minutes. Okay, so then we make the case within our white paper, 7 main arguments, and you can see them on the screen. The idea is transition to a true circular economy. By that I mean a lot of the emphasis on the circular economy policies at the moment some of them are very promising. However, many of them still rely on waste management. What we want to do with this resource management law is how do we bring business initiatives in the market as well to move into that rethink, reduce type of waste hierarchy, where now we can create business models that, of course, dematerialize their business processes, of course. Another aspect of this is how does the EU create a strong new type of diplomacy, a resource diplomacy, let's say, that is different than the one that is pursuing right now, but rather one that promotes global peace and security. We do know that a lot of issues concerning by security, I mean planetary security, not necessarily security in the military means. So with this being said, is that a lot of the conflicts out there are related to resource access, right? Whether it is to sell oil to the international market or to sell conflict minerals to international market. And the reason why these are sold and these military ventures really go through is because there is a market for this demand, right? So in a sense, if the EU reduces its material footprint, it would therefore reduce its material intensity of this economy. therefore could develop a different alternative diplomatic model. And in an area where geopolitical conflicts are really becoming much more tenuous, the EU needs to have a different mechanism set in place so that it's not able to get stuck in between these conflicts now, but also in the future. And then maybe lastly, I will mention just really quickly the importance, of course, of fostering well-being and equity. And this ties to my future, my previous point. The reason why this is an important is not resource management just in the technical level, as circular economy is being pursued at the moment, but within national strategies, the idea is to connect social policies to resource management. By this, I mean, how do social policies in terms of universal basic services, in terms of a shorter working week, how do these relate to reducing material consumption? And actually, how do we then create social policies that are actually targeted to well-being, decarbonization, and dematerialization altogether? And then maybe just the last slide that I will show. The political will is there. There is already a mention of this within the 8th Environmental Action Program. There's already measures, of course, on particular product policies. Maybe just the last slide, because I'm running short on time. Yeah, and then we have also, oh, sorry, the second to last. Yes, we have also countries that are first movers that are already doing this, such as Austria, the Netherlands, Flanders, and Finland, and Spain as well. However, these countries are first movers, so their ability to actually carry out this material footprint reduction will be limited because there's not a cohesive EU process at the moment. And these are not binding either. But if the EU were to move towards a binding resource use reduction target, we would see a different type of economy that would be good for business, good for the planet, good for global peace, and as well, good for the well-being of our citizens. So I'll cut it there just for the sake of time, and would be happy to answer questions.
Diego, thank you so much. Absolutely fantastic. A round of applause, everybody, for the fantastic Diego. Brilliant. Diego, just with regards to this, and I know that there are a number of questions that have come in whilst you've been speaking through different forms, which is absolutely great. You were talking about planetary boundaries and different ways, I guess, in terms of how do you actually calculate those and what does that mean? Can you give us a really simple description of what do you actually mean by the planetary boundaries? Because there are some people here, for them, this might be the first time they're actually hearing this. And so therefore, understanding that concept as a whole, would you be able to give us a quick overview?
Yeah, sure. So the planetary boundaries is a framework that was developed by scientist Rockstrom, and this came out in 2009, I believe. The idea was actually to connect this in a sense towards seeing the biocapacity of the Earth. Focusing on climate change. They have 9 planetary boundaries. Water consumption, for example, so blue and green water. So also focusing on novel entities. So meaning microplastics, pollutants as well, and it's quite comprehensive. The idea is to see in a simplified model, of course, how is the planet able to sustain life within, in terms of our ability to impact the planet. And as of 2023, we unfortunately have already surpassed the 6th planetary boundary, right? We have now effective data and analysis since 2009 of how much our human activities actually impacting the planet. And I mentioned it's just on a planetary level. But if you actually reduce it into individual countries, you actually see that some countries are severely under consuming, and this begins while others are severely over consuming. So in a planet that is very limited in a sense, we only have so many forests, we only have so much capacity for the sea to capture our carbon, we only have so much water in our earth, right? What this means is then it's a question of actually not necessarily growing the pie, the material pie, as I hope this presentation made the case for, but actually on how do we divide that material pie. So yes, that's I have a very simplistic version of planetary boundaries. Yes.
No, thank you for that, Diego. And how does the planetary boundary vision and concept, etc., how does that fit into things like circularity and the circular economy? How do those two concepts come together?
Well, yeah, so that's a good question. On that sense, there is the consumption footprint, which is measured in the mentioned as well last year in the circular economy monitoring framework, and even before, I think it came out already in 2019. So that does take an LCA level method for consumption, but I think at the moment there's still a lack of understanding how our consumption is impacting planetary boundaries still within products. For example, there's a big focus, like I mentioned earlier, on climate change. So a lot of the focus is actually on emissions. How are products impacting emissions, right? Which is in a sense easier to calculate. But the issue, what happens is how are products actually impacting water consumption? How are they impacting chemical pollution? How are they impacting at land use, right? And I feel like at the moment there is still a lot of analysis still needs to be done on that end. And we're hoping that this EU resource management law would really harmonize this type of measures. And not to say that there isn't anything being done. I mean, absolutely there is. And I think ideally a product passport, for example, is a way of moving towards that further analysis of not just focusing on carbon emissions, but also focusing on other aspects of how our products are impacting our ecosystems. Yeah.
Thank you. And you mentioned in your presentation that there are a number of countries that are already, doing a really good job or progressing to that point where they're beginning to hit those targets, such as I think you mentioned Austria, Finland, Flanders, etc. What are they doing that the rest of us should perhaps be trying to emulate?
Yes, that's a very good question. So I think these countries have, first of all, accepted that that our economies are having a disproportionate burden on the planet, and also it's not necessarily leading to higher well-being. So I think these countries want to do something better than what the current proposals is, which is, like I mentioned earlier, my critique of circularity, not like we don't need it, but just that it's unexploited, to use that term, right? So these countries are using these planetary boundaries framework, of course, they're using this material reduction framework, but at the moment it is non-binding, meaning that is a political statement, which is fair enough. I think that's where we should start. The idea is that by making this political statement, as such as in the case of Austria, 80% material footprint reduction, there's still a lot of discussion of, okay, well, how do we achieve this? But I think the political statement is enough to actually move businesses, move institutions, move everything else to actually achieve that. Whether it happens or not, that's to be debated. But I think these countries are much further behind. Much farther ahead than other countries, such as my own country, the United States, for example, that doesn't even recognize its material consumption as an issue, which is actually one of the world's highest. Same with Australia. And what is happening is that they're leaving their economies extremely vulnerable to a world where economic growth, for example, becomes severely stunted by climate change impacts, such as Bloomberg recently last week wrote an article about how climate change is already stunting economic growth. And this is what I'm saying. Like, in a sense, these countries are analyzing their economies. They're saying there is serious climate change impacts that are going to really affect our GDP. So therefore, we need to a different model to make our economies much more resilient. And then obviously, you can argue, of course, relocalizing, reindustrializing, shorter supply chains, what have you, get the workers involved, the trade unions involved, of course, in this. But again, is a democratic at the first core. If I may say one last thing, is this is a democratic debate at the end of the day about how we reduce material consumption. It is not a top-down. There has to be bottom-up approaches as well.
Diego, thank you so much. An awesome start to session 3. Everybody, round of applause for the fabulous Diego. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Excellent.